I hope you're doing well. In today's video, I'd like to read from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 through 8, and then at the end we'll close with verse 9. Again, starting in verse 5. Who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. It says in verse 8, Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. Alright, going back, to verse 5. He says, Who is Paul, who is Apollos? He says, we are just men. And this is pretty much the same thing that Peter says in the book of Acts, where Cornelius falls down before him, and Peter says, Cornelius, get up. He says, I myself am also a man. And that's the exact same attitude that Paul had here. He says, who is Paul? Who is Paul? Of course, Paul knew all the things that he had done, and he likely knew that in the future he would be seen as at least a figure that warranted some respect. No doubt he saw that in himself, at least a little bit, though he was, of course, very, very humble. And we see that reflected here. He says, who am I but just a man? He says, or he asks, who is Apollos but just a man? He says, through whom, he says, we're ministers through whom you believed in God. He says, according to what the Lord has given each one, and of course that's referring to the abilities, the talents that Paul and Apollos were given. We know that they were very intellectual, very brilliant, very talented men. And he says, and of course he turns the glory back over to God. He says, and God has given us these things and the ability to sharpen our talents and use them for good. But notice what he says, ministers through whom you believed. Ministers. Don't forget that the whole purpose of a minister is to give one aid. We see that in the dictionary. Of course, that's what the word means. Minister, someone who is to help you. All right? He says, ministers through whom you believed. He says, you didn't believe in Paul. He says, you didn't believe in Apollos. And hopefully, if you're watching these videos, you don't believe in me, but instead you believe in God. Again, we see the idea of Paul turning the glory back over to God. He says, we're just ministers through whom you believed. He says, you didn't believe in us, you believed in God. Notice in verse 6, he says, I planted. He says, yes, I came along first and put those seeds where they are today. He says, but Apollos came along and watered. But notice what he says. He says, God gave the increase. As a preacher, I feel that the highest part of my career to date is when I baptized someone. All right? No doubt, highest point in my career. I was on cloud nine with that. It was a wonderful thing for me, as it was for her, I'm sure, as well. But we see that all throughout the Church of Christ. We have great, wonderful preachers, no doubt. All right? And I'm sure that as preachers we sit and we think, all right, well, I've baptized so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and that's a great thing. But as preachers we would be remiss, and we'd be very, very sorely mistaken if we didn't realize and say, hey, if it wasn't for God, that wouldn't have happened. We can say as preachers that, yeah, sure, I've preached that sermon. Yes, I've baptized so-and-so. But if it wasn't for God, nothing would have happened. And that's the thing that Paul is pointing out here, and that's the thing that we need to notice. So notice what he says in verse 7, with all these things in mind, neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but God who gives the increase. Again, we see this idea of turning the glory back over to God. Verse 8, he says, now he who plants and he who waters are one, or in other words, they're working towards the same goal, and each will receive his own reward according to his labor. And I'd like to close in verse 9, and we'll talk about this in the following verses in tomorrow's video. I'd encourage you to join me then. But in verse 9 he says, for we are God's fellow workers. We work together. You are God's field. You are God's building. And that's what I want to talk about tomorrow. You are God's building. I hope you'll join me then, and I'd like to thank you for watching.